How are the ancient mummy and Munch's The Scream related? How did Munch get the idea for his most famous painting? Munch was born in Norway in 1863, but he would paint his first serious picture only at the age of 20, and The Scream would come to light when he was 30. Munch's family had no artists, though it was known in Norway's creative circles. Jacob Munch, a noted neoclassical artist, was their distant relative. Aunt Karen, who raised Edvard after his mother's death, made pictures from natural materials. And their distant relative was also Fritz Taulow. At age 7, Edvard became fascinated by the blind procession sketches in the city and his father praying before his older sister's death. Munch's passion for painting, supported by his aunt, kept growing stronger. At the age of 17, despite his father's insistence, he left technical college and entered the Royal School of Drawing, Christian. All his numerous creative relatives who saw talent in Edvard helped him convince his father. Edvard's mentor, naturalist painter Christian Krohg, introduced him to the capital's creative intelligentsia. The painter's first work was the portrait Head Study, which he painted at the age of 20. Then came Girl Lighting a Fire. These paintings drew no attention, which isn't surprising. He was still a beginner. However, with the help of Fritz Taulow, Munch was able to get a scholarship the following year and even visit the Paris Salon. At that time, the Salon was the only annual art exhibition in the world where artists displayed their paintings. It was the most important event of the year, and every artist dreamed of exhibiting at the Salon. Sometimes, just a few hundred out of 5,000 paintings were chosen. This is the year 1884. Back then, there was no internet. Photography was just beginning, so you could only see other artists' paintings in museums and at exhibitions. That's why visiting the Paris Salon was almost a revelation for the young Munch, and believe me, not every artist of that time had the opportunity to go to Paris for the Paris Salon. Munch quickly advanced in his career with his patron's help. And in 1886, just 2 years after his debut, at the Autumn Art Exhibition, Munch presents his new painting, The Sick Girl, inspired by the serious illness of Munch's sister Sophie. However, critics tore the painting to shreds, considering it unfinished. But for critics to even pay attention to such a young artist is already an incredible achievement. However, such criticism deeply affects the young Munch. He withdraws and for the next few years doesn't dare to experiment much anymore. As seen with Malevich and Picasso, boldness and experimentation often help artists stand out and introduce something new to art. Otherwise, you're just like everyone else. And for several years, the artist paints portraits and landscapes in an impressionist manner, experiments with color, tries pointillism, just like all young artists, searching for his own style. In 1889, 4 years before painting The Scream, Munch's father died. He misses the funeral and becomes depressed. In 1890, he painted the famous Night in St. Club, dedicated to his father. This painting, filled with abandonment and loneliness, will make quite a statement. He withdraws from friends, isolates himself, and returns to Norway, where he will soon paint his first Scream, initially under a different name. Now let's take a closer look at how The Scream was created. Munch returns to Christiania, a suburb of Oslo, after visiting the Salon of the Rejected. Near his house, there is a hill with a great view of the fjord, crossed by a pedestrian bridge. This place appears very often in Munch's paintings, and I think it was probably the most picturesque spot in this backwater. In January of '92, Edvard Munch made the following entry in his diary. I was walking with 2 friends. The sun was setting. I was overcome with melancholy. Suddenly the sky turned blood red. I stopped and, exhausted, leaned against the railing. Blood and tongues of flame swept over the black-blue fjord and the city. My friends kept walking, but I stood still, trembling with fear, and felt the horrifying, endless scream of nature. Remember these words. We'll revisit them. Munch admits that it was in this very entry that the idea for the first version of The Scream was born. That year, there was a powerful eruption of the Krakatau volcano in Indonesia, and the skies all over the world and Europe were filled with unusually intense crimson sunsets. And Munch, impressed by this unusual and truly dramatic phenomenon, began working on a series of paintings. The first was the painting Mood at Sunset, later renamed Despair. A man in a hat stands by a bridge, a railing under a blood-red sky, while two men in top hats walk away. Edvard Munch said the two men walking away are his friends, while he's in the foreground, overwhelmed by the crimson scene. See the sketch Edvard Munch drew in his diary next to that entry, and it will be our first clue in unraveling Edvard Munch's thoughts. Initially, Edvard Munch did not intend to depict horror or a human scream. The first version has a fairly ordinary plot. The main focus is the bloody sky, ominously looming over the person and reflecting in his thoughts like water. Renaming the painting is clue number 2. It emphasizes Edvard Munch's desire to enhance the effect of the painting, which originally did not contain any specific emotion. In that same year, 1892, he painted a little-known but extremely important clue for our research, the painting Evening on Karl Johan Street. Look at the man in the foreground. Doesn't the way his face is depicted seem familiar to you? In this painting, Munch tries for the first time to convey the feeling of human loneliness, which can exist even in a crowd. Look, he resorts to the maximum simplification of the human face, making it look more like a mournful skull with 2 dots for nostrils. And this, you have to admit, works. At this moment, he finds that intriguing image, which he'll soon try to express emotionally through screams. In the following year, 1993, he will paint another picture, Death in a Boat, and, look again, we see the image of a skeleton. Munch was generally very fascinated by the theme of suffering and death. His mental health will soon decline, leading to treatment in a psychiatric hospital. Mental illnesses haunt his family, and the approaching clouds already trouble him, frighten him, and inevitably find reflection in his work. It seems to me that these timid forerunners of the scream gradually shaped his future vision of the painting, and we are already almost there. We don't know exactly how this image came to his mind, but the painting Evening on Karl Johan Street suggests to us that it didn't come suddenly. Many art historians believe Edvard Munch may have been inspired by seeing an Inca mummy at the Paris World's Fair, which drew the interest of many creatives. These were the early years of the technological revolution. With the advent of photography, steamships and locomotives, travel around the world became much faster. And museums began to display exhibits from regions of the earth so remote that they had never been accessible to the general public before. And this inevitably caused a stir. Many artists noticed the mummy. Gauguin used her image. It is believed that she served as the prototype for the central figure in the painting Human Sorrow, and for the old woman on the left side of the painting. Where do we come from? Who are we? And where are we headed? And in 1893, he created the first version on cardboard with pastel, already very close to the final scream. Look, we are very interested in this version. It almost exactly repeats the main scream, but with some differences that will give us another clue. Look at the hands. Here we can clearly see that the figure is covering its ears. Many researchers debate if the person in the painting is screaming or blocking out the scream, but this version clearly shows the figure covering their ears. We can see that. And the last words from the diary, and I felt the terrifying endless scream of nature, leave us with no other interpretation. The person in the painting is covering their ears from the sound coming from outside. In that same year, 1893, Munch also presents the final scream in a series of other paintings. This is the most important version of the scream. Look, you can see the influence of Van Gogh here. The same brushstrokes, clearly following the contours of the objects. Munch kept the crimson sky, but replaced his own figure from the first version with a person whose mouth is open in horror. Two barely sketched, indistinct figures are moving away, emphasizing the loneliness of the figure facing the looming blood-red clouds. Nearly everything stayed the same, except the figure in the foreground. And it is precisely this figure that turns out to be something absolutely unusual for the painting of that time. I believe analyzing the painting technique, color scheme or background is pointless, since the foreground figure sets the painting's mood. As we'll see, it will make it famous. Munch is taking a big risk. Never before have artists tried to distort the human body so much, to simplify it to an almost childlike primitive drawing. But there is also one quality here, still unknown to visual artists of that time, but very popular among modern designers like us, the simplification of the advertising object. I would say that the figure in Munch's painting became the world's first logo of an emotion, which we now call an emoji, and that's essentially what it turned into. The painting was first exhibited in Berlin as part of an exhibition called Love. Edvard Munch is already a well-known artist, partly due to a few scandals. His works are drawing art public attention. And now he presents to the world something that looks like a person, but is very, very strange, skeletal, overly simplified. A figure frozen in horror, framed by the sharp lines of sky and water. This was something new, unlike anything before. At that time, artists painted only objects from the real world. Surrealism appeared 30 years later, and Abstractionism followed 20 years after. Then, amid the established Impressionism and Fauvism, this misunderstanding arises. And, of course, a scandal broke out. The events were hotly discussed in the press. Most critics reacted negatively to the painting, some with disgust. However, Munch, used to criticism, responded condescendingly. The scream split the Berlin art scene into supporters and opponents, boosting the artist's recognition and dividing artists into two camps. And even though few people liked his paintings at the time, the number of the artist's supporters began to grow. He became a celebrity in Norway and gained international recognition. The image created by Munch turned out to be so successful that soon it would be firmly associated with human suffering. The effect was intensified by the mental illness that soon developed. The artist Munch was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and the artist's illness became even more pronounced. It thickens the veil of rumors and interpretations, which inevitably tend to suggest that the scream is a premonition of the painful haze of madness. Munch would change the title of the painting several more times, and as usual, this gives us a couple more clues. At first, Munch gave it exactly the same title, Despair. As you can see, there was no emphasis on the scream at the beginning, but a year later, a book about Edvard Munch's work would be published, in the preface of which a Polish writer analyzes Despair, the future scream, in detail. And he writes that the artist managed to show, I quote, the terrifying struggle between reason and sex, in which the latter wins. The hero lover should no longer exist. His sexuality erupts and echoes through all nature. It was this article, according to Munch himself, that made him rename the painting. Do you remember his own words about the scream of nature? I think it's an amazing coincidence between Munch's own words about the scream of nature and the critic. And it guided his thought, as if nature itself suggested this title to him. At first, he changed the title to The Scream of Nature, not of a person, mind you. To broaden interpretation and spark discussion about the scream's nature, he left it simply as The Scream. A popular theory suggests there was a slaughterhouse on the far shore, and the character covers his ears to block the animal's screams. But to me, this idea seems ridiculous. First of all, we have already established that no screams were even planned during the making of the painting. Secondly, there were no animal lovers in the 19th century. Animals were considered food, and anyone who spoke out for humane treatment of food would have been put in a mental institution. There is no evidence that Munch was the first Greenpeace activist on the planet. There is another theory that there was a mental hospital nearby and the moans of the mentally ill echoed over the river. This, of course, sounds dramatic given Munch and his family's history. First, is it a hospital or an Inquisition torture chamber? Also, sound amplifiers didn't exist yet. And it's unlikely that patients were lined up against the wall just to moan a little for Munch. However, it wasn't only the scandal, the artist's illness, and the image's discovery that made Munch's The Scream famous. This painting actually became the first expressionist canvas, and later the calling card of expressionism, opening the door to a new style of painting. But that's not all. Watch what happens next. A series of events will keep increasing the fame of The Scream until the painting completely overshadows the artist himself and becomes his only work widely known to the public. By 1900, Munch is struck by illness. He is admitted to a mental hospital, and this adds even more mystery to The Scream. And in 1908, a book by German psychiatrist Heinrich Stadelmann, Psychology and Art, is published, in which the author explores the influence of mental balance on creativity. The Scream was placed on the cover. From that moment, The Scream became synonymous with mental suffering. In the mid-1960s, it became known that the American military was using napalm in Vietnam, which destroyed entire villages with peaceful civilians. The information shocked American society and sparked mass protests, one of the symbols of which became The Scream. The reproduction appeared on posters, t-shirts, and was seen everywhere. In 1961, The Scream appeared on a magazine cover as an illustration for an article about anxiety in American society. And in 2008, psychiatrists Daphna Simeon and Jeffrey Abugal in Feeling Unreal described the Scream as depicting the private hell of detachment felt by those with depersonalization disorder. And in 1996, the first film of the Scream franchise was released. In it, a serial killer dressed in black and wearing a white mask with a look of horror and a Scream killed high school students in a quiet American suburb. The killer's mask, as admitted by director Wes Craven, was inspired by Munch's painting. This mask became the most popular Halloween costume in the world. The painting was stolen twice in 1994 during the opening of the Olympic Games in Lillehammer. Two thieves broke into the National Gallery in Oslo and stole the Scream, leaving a note saying, "Thanks for the poor security." The painting was relocated to the second floor during the Olympics, which weakened its security. The thieves demanded a ridiculous $1 million in ransom, but were soon found and arrested. In 2004, the 1910 version of the Scream and Madonna were stolen again. Two masked robbers entered the museum in broad daylight and took the painting. A visitor managed to photograph the thieves running to their car, and they were soon arrested, but the paintings were missing. All these events were invariably accompanied by a lot of commotion. With each incident, Munch's The Scream became more famous, standing out from other paintings, which seemed incomprehensible to most viewers with its undeniable authority. In 2012, the pastel version of The Scream was sold at auction to a private buyer for a then-record $120 million. At that time, no painting had ever sold for such a high price. Now the most expensive painting is Salvator Mundi by Leonardo da Vinci, sold in 2017 for $450 million. Watch my video about the 10 most expensive paintings in the world. The link will be in the description. As you can see, my friends, throughout history, the painting has always been surrounded by hype. The image turned out to be so striking that it was reproduced and reinterpreted in hundreds of different ways, from new works of art to emblems and emojis. Now, knowing the painting's full history, we can now say with a fair degree of confidence that the reason for the popularity of Munch's The Scream lies not so much in its artistic value or aesthetics, but in the effectiveness of the image created by Munch. The world's first horror logo, the first emoji, incredibly simple, clear, and memorable. Could you sketch the Mona Lisa's expression from memory right now? Probably not, but I'm sure you could do The Scream. And it's not the dramatic lines or the choice of colors, as art critics claim, that play the main role here, but rather a successful visual idea that fit perfectly into a publicity campaign full of scandals, thefts, and madness. But if today, in our time, some artist painted The Scream, would he be able to become a star in the art world? No chance. For that, he would have needed to be born 150 years ago, when academic art was desperately clinging to its legacy, and have the courage to go against the current and harsh criticism.